Hi, as I said, I'm Andrew Eland. I'm a software engineer who's always been interested at the intersection of technology and cities. And it's been a tumultuous year so far in that space. I think we know that cities are complex systems, and so one would expect that we should be able to bring a lot of societal benefit by using the power of data and technology to better understand and reason about those systems. But it's often been difficult to make work in practice. And at the start of the year, I think the epicenter of that debate was in the micro-mobility space around services provided by dockless bikes and scooters, and the privacy concerns around the data generated from those services, to say nothing of the impact on the urban environment. But obviously, that debate has accelerated incredibly quickly in the response to COVID, particularly in the space of contact tracing and how we manage the urban environments in that space. So it's a fascinating topic, and I'm honored to be joined by three speakers who understand and know about this space in some depth. I would like to introduce Claire, Andrew, and Nick. And I'd like to invite them all to say a few words just to explain who they are in their own words and why they're interested in this space. And I think we'll start with Andrew.
Thank you, Andrew. And thank you, everybody. It's great to be here. My name is Andrew Tsonchev. I am the Director of Technology at Darktrace, which is a UK company that's very focused on using AI for cyber defense. And in the years that I've been at Darktrace, I've worked quite heavily in all our initiatives around protecting smart cities and city infrastructure in various ways. So I have a keen interest in the risks and the threats, and a fair amount of experience firsthand working with companies defending against them. But also, to pick up on something that you briefly mentioned in your opening remarks there, I'm also very fascinated by the positives, the potential positives. And I find a lot of the time when I'm speaking at events and on panels, I find myself playing devil's advocate and trying to resist doomsday narratives about how smart cities are going to be hacked continuously and lead us into complete nightmare scenarios, because I do have a strong passion for their potential for positive change. So I try to temper my gloominess with some real optimism.
Excellent. Thanks for that. Nick, can I invite you to say a few words?
Sure. Likewise, thank you very much for having me here. So I'm Nick Taylor. I lead a team in the Google Cloud Professional Services organization, basically helping organizations move their infrastructure to Google Cloud. So that's a mix of kind of cloud infrastructure, big data, and also our collaboration suite, G Suite. I think likewise, I used to have a role in cybersecurity, and so kind of understands that balance and that trade-off of kind of risk and reward. My view generally is that the cloud is typically more secure and more robust than your average on-premises data center, largely because the cloud providers have a massive vested interest in doing security well. Obviously, then what you do with data and how you make it accessible and the tooling you use around it is really key to maintaining individual privacy and so on. So really interested in joining the discussion today.
Thanks. And Claire.
Great. Hi, nice to be with you all today. I'm Claire Fram. I'm a senior product manager at Arup. Arup is a global firm of designers, engineers, architects, planners in the built environment. And in my role, I've been leading transformation programs for the firm, where my focus is on digital and specifically transport and the kind of intersection there. And so for this panel, I suppose I'm both a consumer of some of these cloudy services, applying new techniques, machine learning in these environments, as well as working with clients, both public and private, to understand how to make use of these systems as well. So looking forward to the discussion today.
Thanks, Claire. Just to frame the discussion at the start, I mean, we hear smart cities, obviously a huge buzzword, perhaps digital twin and the like even more so. But I'd like to dig down a little bit more into the details to actually understand how cities are currently making use of the kind of large-scale data sets that cloud services enable. And I know, Claire, that Arup have always been at the cutting edge of working with technology in the built environment, back from working on computer-aided structural engineering for the Sydney Opera House to the Sagrada Familia's extension at the moment, which I think uses a lot of generative design to actually turn that into something that's buildable. And so from your perspective as being in that kind of organization, perhaps you could tell us a little bit about how you've seen cities using large-scale data analysis to address problems that they have.
Yeah, that's a good question. So I'll talk a little bit about the work that I'm involved in, which is a transport focus, but I think you could apply this to a broader kind of perspective. So in transport, we talk about supply, so the data that we need to have to understand things like roads, bus, underground schedules. And that's often data that city or public authorities own. But then there's also supply in terms of rideshare data, micromobility data. So that's, privately owned data. And then we talk about demand. So that's understanding where people are going. And there's some publicly available data, like travel survey data. And then there's a lot of private owned data and privately collected data. So GPS data from vehicle fleets, from individual level GPS sources, and then mobile data itself. So there's really lots of different types of data, different sizes of data. And I would say in terms of how cities are trying to use this data, cities are very outcomes focused. They're at the core trying to tackle challenges of, how do you connect people to education, health services, jobs, and to deliver that, there's policy people responsible for setting the agenda, driving the agenda, prioritizing which programs might be taken forward, and then they come on to the data, and that's where this conversation sits. And so in kind of that scale of where cities might be thinking about the role of data, the tooling behind it, it can be a challenge to elevate it, if you like, in terms of addressing some of the challenging questions around trust, around security, around ownership, and finding the right kind of tooling for the job. And we often see kind of the transition to the cloud being a key objective. But then when it comes into the details of, okay, what does that mean when you have all of these different types of data that need to be shared in different ways? And it can be quite challenging to unlock different, I don't want to say silos, but different sources, right, where that data is coming from.
Thanks. I know, Nick, you mentioned that Google obviously needs to align itself with protecting users' data within the cloud. Can you tell us a little bit about how large-scale organizations such as the one you work for are working to address some of the challenges that Claire just picked up on there around ensuring kind of the not only providing the level of security that people expect in the data that is held, but also this building of trust in the actual organization that's holding the data.
Yeah, sure. And I think it's interesting, especially where I sit in Google, where I'm helping organizations, so big enterprises or perhaps public sector organizations, for example, move their data to take advantage of our cloud infrastructure. I think that's potentially it's been a hard challenge and a hard journey for Google getting into the cloud space, where there's a perception of Google as a provider of consumer services. So as an enterprise using the cloud, should I be nervous that anyone in Google is going to look at my data or mine it for advertising, for the other side of the business, as it were? And I think, we have had to be very rigorous in making sure that, obviously we're doing right by our customers, but really doubling down on the messaging and helping people understand the implications of putting data in the cloud. I think Claire was right to point out that there's kind of two angles to that, which is, putting data and storing it in the cloud where it's private and it belongs to an organization, making sure that data is secure and well protected so that only that group of people can access it, and that it is well managed. So Google has, an absolute ton of controls around confidential computing and making sure that data is well secured and restricted to that organization. But also then you look at other services, so if you're a user of Google Maps or of Waze, that data, that's aggregated data on trips and history and so on, being used to support cities in looking for issues in the transport network. It's likely that Waze or Google Maps will notice that traffic is slower in a location because there's an accident far faster than people actually reporting the accident. So it's then very important to understand how that data is appropriately managed and secured so that no data about any individual is ever shared, and there's not really a way for us to be able to do that. That's done in a privacy-aware kind of way, so that you establish and maintain that trust relationship, both at the consumer end and at the sort of enterprise end, whether that enterprise is a private organization or a public body.
Thanks. Nick mentioned that about the efforts that Google are putting into protecting data in those spaces. Perhaps Andrew, I know that you said at the start that you'd like to approach this with an air of positivity and the potential of what you can do with data, and we can certainly get to that. But just to frame the landscape, I'd love to hear about some of the challenges and the kind of attacks that you feel that cities have to defend themselves against as more and more of their data moves into cloud environments.
When we think about the bad stuff, I completely agree, by the way, that there's quite a lot of, I think, fairly lazy analysis that happens that blames cloud or cloud infrastructure in any real capacity for the challenges. I totally agree that most cloud infrastructure providers do a better job of securing the environment than traditional data centers and other hosting. So it's not the cloud problem, it's the exposure problem, really, and it's the complexity problem. And I think it's interesting to try and focus in on what's unique about cities, because there's a whole host of challenges that come with any organization that collects, processes, and then stores complex data in the cloud or anywhere else. But what's different with cities, I think, are a few things. One is the degree of interconnectedness and interoperability between third parties in a city is quite huge. Most sort of smart data initiatives, smart city initiatives, have many different groups collaborating together on either open or proprietary data sets. And so there's a lot of linkage between different groups trying to share the same platform. That's a significant portion of the risk that city municipal authorities face when they try to spin up these smart city projects. Another is the type of devices that are now being connected up in various ways to cloud backends. You're dealing with a really weird mixed bag of stuff. And the organizations that I work with, they're talking about protecting traditional IT systems, cloud data systems, very old legacy city infrastructure, operational technology type stuff, like the utilities and the water supply and the power networks. And then they've also got business systems, and they've got all this IoT stuff that you get with smart cities. So this incredibly disparate environment of different types of devices and the stitching together of that into a cohesive framework, often with a cloud backend, I think is the central complexity challenge that cities face. And I think the final sort of ingredient in this sort of store that they have often is resourcing. A lot of the city departments find themselves now responsible for protecting the data that comes off like smart corridor IoT initiatives, and they're also managing smart meters in people's homes, but they're also overseeing the courts and court records, and they're dealing with all sorts of citizen services and schooling and policing. All of this is typically with a very small IT team. So I think the complexity has kind of run ahead of a lot of the responsible teams in trying to secure this new, very connected infrastructure that they have to look after.
Thanks. I think that's a good summary. Is we heard from you that the range of devices and systems being linked up increases the surface area and the chance of exposure to some of these concerns. I think this is kind of looking at the use of data from a very kind of technical standpoint. Perhaps I think it'd be interesting to explore whether or not it always makes sense from a policy or societal standpoint to be kind of working with and collecting that data in the first place. So I wonder if, Claire, as somebody who's kind of working with cities on these projects, whether you had thoughts on that line on when it's justified to collect data and when it's not, and how you make that decision.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I'll also caveat this by saying I am not a civil servant or don't work, for the mayor's office. I work in the private sector, but had the opportunity to speak with many different city councils and transport authorities, both in the UK and globally. So I'll just share some reflections from that work. But if there are people from cities who are kind of following along, please do send in your questions to keep us honest. So there's I want to respond to the point that you made, Andrew, about what data is worth collecting is kind of what you're asking. But before I do that, I might just touch briefly on an exercise that we did a few months ago with our city modeling lab, where we invited in members of public and private organizations to talk about some of the consequences, intended and unintended, that might result from a really data-driven machine learning approach to planning in cities. And what might that do? And there's three different areas of kind of negative, unintended consequences that were identified that as a product team and an R&D team were raised or put on our radar for us to mitigate against. One is this understanding of experts. So we're talking today a lot about data and cloud and security, and we know that each one of those words is actually a short, is jargon for a whole heap of other topics, if you like. And so sometimes we can use language to make things sound more complicated or obfuscate what the technology and data actually is and is doing. And that can make it really hard for people who are trying to make policies in cities understand what investment in different services might actually mean. So when we think about, then in government, when we hear, we should be recruiting more weirdos, it makes it sound like there's this special knowledge that only a few people can actually obtain, and that we need those people within our public institutions to make sure that we're following an appropriate roadmap, if you like. So that's, I think, a challenge. How do you make expertise? How do we make sure that experts aren't held within kind of particular institutions? We also know that bad data gives us bad answers. And so we can make more complicated systems to make our data really secure and make sure that we're sharing it with only the right people. But if that data is not very good quality or is incomplete or is mismanaged, not kept up to date, then actually that can be quite dangerous in terms of the decisions that are made off the back of it, both in terms of prioritizing improvements, but also identifying where things have gone very wrong, where we need data to help amplify where systems have failed. And that leads on to some of the policy questions around personal data, because not all data that we're talking about is personal data, but personal data is quite an important type of data to talk about. And I would argue there's a use to have cities be able to access personal information. We're designing our built environment for people, having data about how people are using that space and how different communities of people use that space differently is actually very important in terms of the feedback that we get into how do we then improve it or again correct systems that are failing. But figuring out the then appropriate governance around that, right? How do you give people control over that information? That I think is an important question that relates back to the original question that you posed, Andrew, which is, what type of information should we be collecting, and how do we kind of plan for that? Like, what's the exit strategy? Do we always need to collect information, for example, in our COVID context? Do we always need to collect information about who you maybe have been in contact with? What's the exit strategy look like? And how do individuals opt in for kind of altruistic greater participation and kind of benefits for a wider community versus setting guardrails around, when that's not okay. When I said I would participate because everybody in my neighborhood would participate, but it's just me and one other person, that changes kind of the conditions under which I consented to. So experts and who understands what these systems are, what the data is, quality of information, and then understanding personal data are three of the policy or kind of themes that I think are important to highlight.
Thanks. It's some very interesting viewpoints there, and I would like to perhaps discuss those a little bit with Andrew and Nick as people who have been responsible for building or advising on the construction of technical systems in the urban environment. Obviously, I mean, we're seeing this play out writ large at the moment in the debates between Twitter and Trump and what is a platform and what isn't a platform. Obviously, the goal of securing systems and security in general is to prevent unintended consequences from those systems from affecting the environment they manipulate. And I wonder, and perhaps I'll start with Andrew first, how much of this threat model do you see as something that you as a company would have to address in the following years? Or do you think there's a very clear line between the services offered by security consultancies such as yourself and security service providers, between that and using data in a way that is perhaps secure, but then still leads to unintended consequences? Like, what responsibility do you as an organization who are certifying the security of platforms or providing services to support the security of platforms have when it comes to working with those kind of data sources?
Yeah, not an easy question, that. Lots to it. I think Unintended consequences is a huge one, and a large part of the discussion needs to be political and social in nature. And I don't think it's appropriate for technology consultants and providers of security to be making those kinds of decisions. I think our responsibility, as much as possible, is to try to diminish the degree of trade-offs that exist between the options that are available to policymakers. So if we think about what we've been saying about good and bad data gathering and where the line is and the trade-offs, you can be smarter about your data collection so that you can have less trade-off. So for example, it doesn't take much to design data collection storage in such a way that it's just as effective to the end goal, but it's anonymized or pseudonymized so that there's far less personally identifiable information in there. Those kinds of algorithmic improvements and data science improvements are something that technology companies should work on so that they can present a range of options with fewer trade-offs in them. Another is that we can be, I think, much smarter about the data we're collecting. There's kind of, I think, a movement away from a slightly legacy approach to big data, which was like, grab all the data in the world, shove it all in some big data lake somewhere, and then we'll figure out later what we're looking for. It's like dumb collection and then smart analysis. There's lots of trade-offs involved in that. You're building an incredibly dangerous repository of data. There's a lot of movements towards a much smarter form of data collection now, where you're doing a lot more processing at the edge and you're doing a lot more modeling with machine learning so that you're not just building up these massive raw data sets that are inflammatory. You're training sparse data in machine learning systems in a way that's got far fewer potential for privacy abuse and misuse in that. And so I think certainly when we've been involved in this, when I've been involved in this, I think architecturally we're looking to try to minimize the trade-offs as much as possible with technology, and then just present the range of options and let the good versus bad data collection decision be driven just by the sort of ethics and governance side of it as much as possible.
Thanks. Just picking up on a couple of points that you made there. You mentioned kind of advances in data science and the like, allowing you to conduct the same kind of analysis as you would normally, but with less detailed underlying data and exposing less data surface area. I would wonder, how mature do you think the space is in that kind of technology? Is that something that you think should and can be commonplace nowadays, or are there systems and services that need to be created over the coming 10 years to create those things? And perhaps similar to that, perhaps they could be considered as a double-edged sword in the way that analyses and uses of data that may be considered too sensitive to perform on raw identifiable data suddenly seem more palatable when used on, let's, for want of a better word, anonymized data, therefore perhaps sidestepping exactly some of the ethical and societal considerations that you perhaps would have anyway. So I'd be interested in your thoughts on a couple of those 2 points before I come to Nick to talk about those.
The last one's really interesting. I think you're right. There is a danger there, and you can trade very obvious risks for far less easily quantifiable risks. So the NHS track and trace app is a good example of that. I happen to be in favor of that, which the centralized approach that that app's taken, which puts me a little bit at odds with some of the information security community. But that's a good example where that data set, which is anonymized, has the potential to be weaponized if it's combined with other data sets in a way that's far less intuitive and far less easy and obvious for policymakers to understand. And so you're right, you trade an obvious set of risks for maybe a slightly more amorphous and weird set of risks. I do think that the trade-off's still positive. I'll give you a simple example about what I'm talking about in terms of how this is real. In cybersecurity, let's say you want to spot somebody, a malicious employee inside a company that is acting at odds with the goals of the company and trying to steal intellectual property or something. The traditional way of doing that, by and large, was to inspect the content of their communications, what they were saying, in a fairly simplistic way, to look for little warning signs like keywords, much like how the intelligence services try to do counterterrorism by looking for certain key terms in online behavior. To do that kind of approach, you need a massive data set, and it's incredibly sensitive because you have to hold lots of raw conversations. The more modern approach to do that in cybersecurity is to profile instead the behavioral cues of a person, so that you can say that they look suspicious, not based on what they're saying, but how they're saying it. Much like, you don't need to speak a language to say that two people who are speaking a foreign language to you look like they might be doing something shifty if they're like hiding in the shadows in your company past working hours, like whispering, trying to avoid detection. They could be up to no good. So this shift towards a sort of metadata analysis can achieve the same kind of results with far less sensitive data storage. So that's kind of a concrete example for that.
Okay, thanks. That makes sense. Nick, coming back to your role of working with companies, you mentioned earlier that Google is in, can sometimes be seen as a tricky situation because it is both providing those underlying cloud services, but then also providing consumer products. And so you have to be extra clear that there is a wall between the two. And I think there is this question of what is a basic piece of compute infrastructure that anybody could use versus what is actually enabling one very particular type of product to which perhaps you are responsible for the consequences. Is quite an interesting one. And obviously last year we saw the Maven project, for example, where a number of engineers raised a concern, ultimately leading to that project being cancelled, which theoretically was about providing generalized compute infrastructure for any service, but a project for which the engineers on that team actually disagreed with. And so I wouldn't want to try to put you in a position as speaking for Google as a company, because obviously that's going to be pretty tricky. But you personally, as somebody who leads a team of engineers and works on these things, like, how are you making those decisions? How do you decide when you're simply applying a general technology versus when you are taking on some element of responsibility for what is done with that technology?
Yes, I think it's certainly an interesting topic. I think if you look at that specific project, and actually what's come since with Google is Google now has a set of AI principles. We had some process there before, but now a very formalized process of using custom technology to help any particular industry or challenge where perhaps you're building AI models and things like that. I think that's a Google challenge, but I think it's a broader organizational challenge as well, where you're building machine learning models, or you're helping an organization understand how to use that kind of technology. I think it's a very difficult area to play, because often there isn't necessarily a very simple explanation. So Google's been working very hard on what we call explainable AI, and I think it's a reasonably common term, but really where you're looking at how you're building AI, ML models, what the sources of data are, what the parameters for building that kind of model, and what the tool does. And that could be whether it's in something particularly sensitive, like a military project, or something much more perhaps generic, which could be something as simple as doing image recognition in a set of photos, which might be as simple as, is this a cat or a dog? But when you're building that kind of technology, you also then need to think about maybe I'm trying to do facial recognition. Google very deliberately does not have a facial recognition AI service. You can't upload photos and get back names, even if you map for people. We just don't have a service for that, because the organization believes that there's sufficient risk in those technologies being used for things that are ethically dubious, perhaps. So yes, it's certainly a difficult area. I think actually talking to the broader challenge as well, and I think Claire mentioned, is if you look at gathering sets of data to do that kind of analysis, it's really hard to get that right. And I think we should always be erring on the side of caution of, is it worth using that kind of technology? Should we, err on the side of gathering the most limited set of data, even knowing then that might mean we can't use it in the ways that people might want to, because actually it's better for people's privacy to choose not to do that.
Thanks. So I think we're just coming up on under 10 minutes left of the session, and obviously the theme of the conference this year is how do we get the next 10 years right? So we've talked about the challenges with moving complex connected systems to the cloud when you have a large range of devices connected to it. We've talked about the taxonomy of information that Claire gave us around public information versus kind of the private and who's responsible for it. Over the next 10 years, what do you think needs to happen to move this space forward, and what do you think can actually help us delivering what I'm sure is possible in terms of improving the quality of service that people see from the environments in which they live? And a somewhat expansive question, but I'd like to start with Claire for that one before proceeding on to Andrew and then Nick.
Sure. So I think there's three things that we can focus on when it comes to getting the cloud right. The first is about competition for cloud services. I think it's important for our cities to think about, resilience and having a diverse portfolio of the services that they use. And that means that there needs to be interoperability between the tooling and the services that get built on top of, any cloud system. The second is ownership. So I think we do need to have be a bit more imaginative about what ownership could mean when we talk about data. It's not, open, closed, personal, public. There really is more of a spectrum. And so how do we think about incorporating or making data valuable, especially personal information data valuable to the communities that it's from and about, before making it perhaps benefit private companies? And then the third piece is to really focus on what we're seeing more and more is when we talk about personal information is surveillance, and also what is the exit strategy. So we know that, I would argue, right, that knowledge is not emergent. It doesn't just come from having lots of data. We need to have hypotheses in place about what it is we're trying to get from our information. How long do we actually need that information for? And so setting out kind of a clear roadmap of how we make use of that information.
Thanks. Andrew, what are your thoughts for the next 10 years?
Well, I'm going to use this to do a little bit of that sort of more utopian stuff, if you like, which is that, leaving aside for a second the very real and significant challenges around how we get better at protecting data, how we get better at assessing some of these trade-offs we've been talking about in the storage and processing of data in the cloud, assuming that we kind of continually grapple and fumble our way appropriately through that. I think what needs to happen for us to really unlock the potential benefits of smart cities over the next 10 years is we just need to be far more enabled and aggressive in the type of data gathering that we can do. It's access to data that holds us back from the good things we want to achieve today. So, if you think of a city as an organism, cities are kind of machines for us to live in, but the city, even today, even the most smart cities that are out there, like City Las Vegas is a great example, they're still really far away from anything like the complexity and sophistication of like the human body as an organism. And that's because they're still largely opaque. We're still largely not able to get the data visibility that we need into city systems. And so what's changing that is 5G and is IoT and is the form factor of devices and is the type and nature of sensors. And I think over the next 10 years, it's going to be that physical engineering work on data collection systems and how to interweave a sensor fabric better into the city that is going to unlock the big leaps and bounds. It's not going to be advances in machine learning and AI or cloud data processing and storage. That's in place, I think. I think the thing that's holding us back is lack of access to the right data, which is a hardware challenge.
Thanks. And Nick?
Thank you. Yeah, I think probably echoing a bit of both of those things, probably three things that come to mind. The first one is to make this work, it really needs to be user-centric. So, in the context of a city, that means me as an individual living in the city, but also the kind of city organization. Claire mentioned earlier the difference. She works for a private organization. We all work for private organizations, and yet, working with city, government, whoever to build those services is making sure that they are done with the citizen, with the public in mind when you're building them. And so correspondingly, the next thing that comes to mind is that those things are open. So, defaulting to open for the data that's gathered, obviously not sensitive data, but making me as an individual understand what data is being collected about me, but also making the data available more generally for people to build apps. TfL is a great example already of building an app ecosystem on top of the data that they gather. But that means, open source tooling, open source code, open data by default, open cloud as well, that data is easily accessible by people and easy to move, that the provider doesn't matter underneath. I guess also in terms of open, open to new ideas, being open to finding new ways of building services. And I think having open data as much as possible allows that kind of collaboration and, smart people to build on top of it. But then I guess the sort of corollary of that is making that relevant. We've touched on a little bit sort of minimization. I think people talk about anonymization or pseudonymization of data. There's always a risk that those things are perhaps undoable. So actually just being mindful, with the proliferation of IoT devices, of 5G, of the cloud being cheap, actually, despite Andrew's point, I think there are lots of organizations I speak to today who now kind of suddenly, who are discovering the cloud for the first time, are just touching that wave of the cloud is cheap, we'll store everything forever. And I think we really need to get to a point, especially in things like cities, where we're only gathering data that we really need to, that's useful, that's valuable for the city and its citizens, and not just to make money off the back of, for example. So making it really relevant and making the use cases transparent to users and the public, so that that there's trust in the whole system, I think is massively important. Trust is probably the big final consideration there.
Trust definitely is, I think, in my mind at least, the major consideration. I think we're out of time, so it just remains for me to thank all of your for your fascinating insight on that panel. I know that for those of you who have the right level of ticket, you can join us afterwards to continue a more in-depth discussion. If you post questions via Slido, we'll be around to answer them on a separate stream in around 15 minutes time. And with that, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Well done, everyone. Thanks for a great session. And to echo Andrew's point, 15 minutes to go. Please feel free to come back to ask Andrew, Nick, and Claire any further questions that you might have on this session. And just as a reminder, our next and final session of this track today will be at 5 p.m., which is all about the technology that is underpinning our cities. So not to miss that one. So thanks to everyone. Great to have you with us. And come back in about 10 to 15 minutes if you've got the right ticket to get to know our speakers a little bit better. Thank you.
Want access to more CogX videos? Subscribe now for free at cogx.co.